Trick your enemies, you first gotta trick your allies.
How stylish.
It's kick-ass! This should work nicely.
All right, it's time for people to start coming to their senses.
This place with its old plantations. These roads leading out to sea.
Hi Dad, Robbie's gonna do the clap this time and then say a couple things because this is kind of his episode, so good job, sport.
In 1969, my mother and father moved from Jacksonville to Macon because of the deal that the Allman Brothers Band had signed with Phil Walden and Capricorn Records. In 1975, my mother and father had separated, and that fall I started kindergarten in Juliet, Georgia. By the time summer break was over in 1976 and I was ready to start first grade, the Allman Brothers had split up. My mom, my sister, and I moved to Jacksonville. In the summer of 1977, we went to spend some time with my dad, and I took my first trip across I-10 to Tallahassee. For the next 10 years, I would spend a chunk of my summer in Tallahassee at Dad's place, back among the canopy roads, just off Lake Jackson. His neighbors were like doctors and academics. But if you think about it, my dad just a couple of years ago was in a band that was making 6 figures a gig. And although we never talked about it specifically, I can imagine it might have taken some time to reconcile that he was now, in place of spending summer weekends touring and selling out arenas, he was on a riding mower and watching the Braves on TBS. At just 29 years old, he'd seen the beginning of the Allman Brothers, seen them rise to amazing success, and then seen what at the time seemed to be the end of it all. And after the dust settled and he sobered up a bit, he found he'd landed in Tallahassee. And until I graduated high school in 1988, Tallahassee, to me, was Dad's house. But then I got accepted to FSU, and from 1988 to 1993, Tallahassee was also my home. I was there for the groundbreaking of my father's recording studio, Pegasus Studios, and I was there when he had to bankrupt it and sell it to Florida State. While I was living in Tallahassee, I was broke and struggling, despite working 3 jobs. During my time there, I lived in 2 apartments and 2 houses, eventually settling into the band house on Richmond Street. I had my first serious girlfriend, and then she left town, and a few months later, I ended up living with a girl for the first time. I worked at a Burger King. I did data entry for the head of the Florida State University Film School. I installed car stereos and professional audio. I was part of a sound crew that had provided gear for everyone from underground hip-hop clubs to Florida A&M University's homecoming concert. I ran sound freelance for 2 different clubs. I hosted a weekly jam. And of course, I had my first serious band. I was part of a musical community. And believe it or not, at no point during my years in Tallahassee did I own a car. My time in Tallahassee was only 5 years of my life. But they were important years, ages 18 to 23. And interestingly enough, when I left, so did my dad. After the Allman Brothers reformed in 1989 and he began touring again, he moved the family to Palm Beach, to a much nicer home. And what precisely does any of this have to do with the mountain goats? Well, not a thing. But since the only thing I know about the mountain goats is that John Hodgman occasionally talks about them on his podcast, I had to talk about something. The name of the album is Tallahassee. It's a stretch, but I'll allow it. Thank you. Shall we then? Yep. Fire it up.
This day, full of promise and potential.
This album is about a couple that John Darnielle had written about for a number of years before Tallahassee came out, called the Alpha Couple. They are an alcoholic, very unhappy couple. Before Tallahassee came out, he had written a number of songs about them spreading over various albums. The older songs about the Alpha Couple usually started with the word alpha in the name. This album functioned as a send-off to the Alpha Couple. I don't believe he's written any songs about them after it came out. But the whole album is about them, and the final song on the album, Alpha Rat's Nest, began with the word alpha as a callback to the older songs. The album talks about how they moved to Florida and they're engaged in a very complicated relationship where they both loathe and love each other and themselves, and it culminates in them burning their house down with them inside of it.
Okay, switching gears. Let's talk about the actual music now, right? The album Tallahassee by the Mountain Goats. Cue it up the first time, listen most of the way through, and honestly, my first thought was, if the love child of John Denver and Kermit the Frog replaced Jack Black in Tenacious D, and they decided to try and become Bob Dylan, you might get something that sounds like what I'm hearing here. A lot of these songs sounded sparse. So sparse, they often feel unfinished to me. Phrases end in awkward places. Chord progressions don't always resolve. But mostly a lot of these songs sounds as if they could just use some additional instruments. Take Idols of the King, for example. One of the more harmonically interesting tunes on the album. Due to the completely wacky choice to reharmonize the top note, the G note, in what would otherwise be the spot of the 4 chord, by throwing an E minor 7 flat 5 underneath it. Kind of interesting, right? Well, check this out. Here is the instrumentation for that song as recorded. Just electric guitar and bass. But check out how much better it could have sounded just by adding a very simple drum track, a bit of keyboards, and bringing the bass up a bit. And that's the thing. It's not like all the songs on Tallahassee have this half-formed quality. See America Right and Oceanographer's Choice both feel fuller and more polished, which makes some of the other musical choices on the rest of the album more curious to me. But look, okay, I'm still in early times here. This is just my first impression. Maybe this will end up being like Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home, right? Where half the album is a full rock band and half the album is just solo acoustic guitar, voice, and harmonica. And it feels exactly as it should. The early standout song for me is No Children. Man, what a hateful bellicose number that is. It certainly gets your attention. Look, I won't do the whole thing, but you have to check this out. Very 60s folk revival, right? An upbeat little 6/8 number. Maybe they're going to sing about a folk hero like Cordwood Pete or Johnny Caw. Or maybe some kind of workers' anthem involving hammers. Or maybe something about crossing a river or bathing in a river or paddling down the river or some other river-based religious allegory. Well, no, actually. Here's what the Mountain Goats actually sang about. I hope I cut myself shaving tomorrow. I hope it bleeds all day long. Our friends say that it's darkest before the sun rises. We're pretty sure they're all wrong. I hope it stays dark forever. I hope that the worst isn't over. And I hope that you blink before I do. I hope I never get sober. And I hope when you think of me years down the line, you can't find one good thing to say. And I hope that if I found the strength to walk out, you'd stay the hell out of my way. That's not something you hear every day, is it? And there's enough wacky things like that to keep me interested in what else might be in these tunes. According to what Astrid told me, this is supposed to be a concept album of sorts. So I guess the next step is, let's see if I can pull the thread out of what I'm hearing. Yo, dude, you ready for some more? Do it.
More clay pigeons for you and me.
So that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you, Robbie. I'm gonna start off with the negatives, I think. So, all in all, it's a little hard to get used to John Darnielle's voice. He kind of sounds like an angsty Weird Al Yankovic.
Who mocks him and laughs at him as he's repeatedly crushed and maimed. Hope you enjoy it!
But that's okay. I kind of got used to it over time, but part of that is just being exposed to his music and how much he listens to the Mountain Goats, so I don't know, it might take a little more time. I wish that there was more diverse musicality in this album. You know, all in all, it's pretty simple. However, I don't think that avid listeners of the Mountain Goats are listening to the Mountain Goats for its musicality. I think they're listening to it for its lyricism, which is very, very strong in this album. And I think that the songs that do have a little bit of a more diverse musicality are my favorites. So that would be No Children and I think Oceanographer's Choice. I think those two songs are super, super strong. When I first heard No Children, I thought it was very sad, but then as I listened to the album over the week, it's kind of a power song. It's kind of a power anthem. So, yeah. No Children, Oceanographer's Choice, definitely my top two. There are a few lyrics that really stuck with me that I think about a lot. In Alpha Rat's Nest, the lyric, someday we'll both wake up for good, I'll try my best not to scream. I think I catch myself thinking about that lyric quite often, actually.
After a few more listens to Tallahassee, I'm actually starting to get vibes of In the Aeroplane Over the Sea by Neutral Milk Hotel, one of the few indie rock albums I actually sincerely like. Similar timbres, similar song structures, similar instrumentation. When I pointed that comparison out to Astrid, they said, I can see that, just not as romantic. Very, very not romantic. And I think that their particular observation is cool for a few reasons. One, they're listening to music for reasons other than the same old love and heartbreak songs. They're actually interested in finding more in their music. Two, they knew who Neutral Milk Hotel was. And three, they got the bigger picture a hell of a lot quicker than I did. Because the bigger picture in Tallahassee is a couple's last-ditch attempt. It's about the execution and then the failure of a complete Hail Mary. It's the notion that a fresh start will put everything right, but instead, you just end up burning it all to the ground. It's about a couple that moves from Tampa to Tallahassee to try and get their marriage back on track, but they end up drunk, bloodied, and beyond hope. You know what it is? It's Victor Nunez's Florida. Do you know Victor Nunez? Victor Nunez is an incredible director, one of my favorites. He made Ruby in Paradise with Ashley Judd. He made Yuli's Gold with Peter Fonda. He made Coastlines with Timothy Oliphant. All his films are set in Florida, but not TV Florida, not Florida Man Florida, not Disney Florida, not Spring Break Florida, actual Florida. And for those of you that have never encountered actual Florida is simultaneously home to the most southern, rednecked, Confederate flag, cold, dead hands folks you'll ever meet, while also home to some of the most neighborly, dysfunctionally community-focused, laid-back, tolerant folks you'll ever meet. And the thing is, they're usually the same folks. And maybe I'm projecting, but that version of Florida feels like it's lurking in the background of this album. For my dad, Tallahassee was transitioning from rock star to middle class for a decade or so. For me, Tallahassee was a relatively safe place to figure out how to be an adult and how to be a gigging musician. For Astrid, whether they know it or not, Tallahassee was their spiritual birthplace and has affected them in ways that I'm not quite sure they're aware of. On this album by the Mountain Goats, though, Tallahassee is ambitions and optimism sabotaged by resentment, alcoholism, and unchanneled anger. And if all of their albums are like this to some degree, I can say that the music of Mountain Goats seems to be very literate in this album, in Tallahassee. I do hear direct references to Flannery O'Connor and Charles Bukowski and a few others. I appreciate literate music, but as a rule, I prefer more music in my music. I do like it, though. It's entirely possible I'll get further into the catalog. I might become a Mountain Goats fan eventually. For now, this album is okay. Good call, Robbie.
So, yeah, all in all, very strong. Wish it was a little bit more complex. I saw some similarities to Frank Zappa in a way with how John Darnielle writes kind of concept albums that I thought was really cool. But all in all, very strong. So, and also, this marks the halfway point in season 2. So, we are exactly halfway through the album. So, very exciting. From here on out are the albums that I am definitely more familiar with than my dad. Before this point, these are all albums that I had never really listened to either. So, from here on out, this is kind of my home territory and stuff I'm more familiar with. So, yeah. Sorry if it's a little bit longer this time, but
And I dreamed of vultures in the trees around our house. Cicadas and locusts, and the shrieking of innumerable gibbons. All of them, all of them, all of them, all of them, all of them. Allow while we ride this wave out. Allow till someone